Right now, Lake Powell is approaching a threshold that could silence Glen Canyon Dam's turbines, with projected inflow falling to roughly 30% of the historical average. The reservoir is not empty. Water still stretches between the canyon walls, but the height that gives that water its power is disappearing, foot by foot, narrowing the distance between normal operation and a level known as minimum power pool. Federal projections show that under a severe but plausible runoff scenario, the lake can fall below 3,490 feet, the elevation beneath which Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower. But that is not the most frightening part. The first major failure of the Colorado River system may not arrive as dry faucets or an empty reservoir. It may arrive quietly, inside a powerhouse, when water can still be released, but can no longer fall with enough pressure to produce electricity. The river would still exist, yet one of its most valuable functions would already be gone. That raises a larger question. What happens when a system built to supply water, generate electricity, stabilize the grid, irrigate farms, and support cities begins losing those functions one at a time? Viewers can like, subscribe, and leave their location in the comments, because the distance from the Colorado River may be smaller than it appears. The white bathtub ring, stretching across the sandstone walls of Lake Powell, is no longer just a reminder of past water levels. It has become a measuring stick for how much safety the Colorado River system has already spent. Every foot of exposed rock represents water that once acted as insurance against dry years, failed snowpacks, and rising temperatures. That insurance is shrinking. At first glance, the reservoir still appears enormous. Boats still move across its blue surface. Glen Canyon Dam still releases water into the Colorado River below. Tourists still photograph the same dramatic cliffs. From a distance, nothing suggests that one of the most important water systems in North America is approaching one of the most sensitive operating thresholds in its history. Yet the real story is unfolding beneath the surface, inside engineering limits that cannot be seen from the shoreline. The people already feeling the pressure are spread across 7 American states. Tribal nations, northern Mexico, farming communities, rapidly growing desert cities, rural electric cooperatives, and millions of households that may never realize how dependent they are on a single river flowing through one of the driest regions on the continent. Nearly 40 million people receive water that is directly or indirectly connected to the Colorado River. Millions of acres of farmland rely on its deliveries to grow vegetables, fruit, cattle feed, and crops that supply grocery stores across the United States. At the same time, Glen Canyon Dam produces hydropower that supports public utilities, irrigation districts, tribal communities, municipalities, and rural customers through the Western Area Power Administration. For decades, these different functions operated together so reliably that they became almost invisible. Water storage, flood control, electricity generation, recreation, environmental management, and interstate water deliveries all depended on the same reservoir quietly doing its job. That quiet reliability is now under increasing pressure. Federal water managers are no longer asking only how much water will arrive this year. They are asking whether enough water will arrive to preserve the operational flexibility that keeps the entire system stable. Forecasts indicating inflow at roughly 1/3 of the historical average force difficult decisions long before any reservoir reaches empty. Every release downstream must be balanced against the need to preserve elevation inside Lake Powell. Every gallon sent through the turbines helps meet downstream obligations, but also lowers the reservoir that keeps those turbines operating. Every management decision becomes a trade-off instead of a routine procedure. That is why official warnings have become noticeably different in tone. They are no longer focused only on drought conditions. They increasingly discuss protecting critical reservoir elevations, maintaining operational flexibility, and preparing contingency actions if runoff continues to disappoint. Those phrases sound technical, but they describe a system that is gradually consuming the margin designed to absorb uncertainty. The danger is not a dramatic collapse overnight. The danger is a sequence of smaller losses that slowly remove options. One disappointing snow season becomes two. A hot summer increases evaporation. Dry soils absorb more melting snow before it can reach streams. Less runoff enters the reservoir. Reservoir elevation falls. Hydropower capacity weakens. Emergency operating measures become more common. The buffer becomes thinner again. This chain of events reaches ordinary people in ways they rarely notice. A farmer deciding whether enough irrigation water will arrive for planting season. A tribal community waiting for long-promised water infrastructure. A rural electric cooperative purchasing replacement electricity because inexpensive hydropower is no longer available at previous levels. A municipal water manager trying to reassure residents while preparing backup conservation plans. None of these stories begins with an empty lake. They begin with a system that has become less forgiving. That is why this matters even to viewers living thousands of miles from the American Southwest. The Colorado River is one of the clearest demonstrations of how modern infrastructure depends not simply on resources, but on reserves. Engineers never designed these reservoirs to survive only average years. They designed them to absorb bad years without society noticing. The hidden reserve was the real product. Once that reserve begins disappearing, every future drought becomes more expensive. Every operational decision becomes more difficult, and every forecast carries greater consequences than the one before. Standing on the rim of Glen Canyon today, the water still looks immense. But the question facing engineers is no longer whether water remains inside the reservoir. The question is how much resilience remains inside the system that depends on it. That difference is what transforms this from another drought story into a warning about infrastructure itself. The Colorado River is not simply carrying less water. It is gradually losing the flexibility that allowed millions of people to believe the system could always adapt to one more dry year. The most important number in this story is not the amount of water still visible from the shoreline. It is the amount of buffer that has already disappeared. The entire Colorado River storage system was built with a combined storage capacity of roughly 58 million acre-feet, an engineering reserve designed to smooth out wet years, dry years, floods, and prolonged droughts. Today, only about 37% of that total storage remains. That sounds like an abstract percentage until it is translated into something real. An acre-foot is enough water to cover an entire acre of land to a depth of 1 foot, or roughly 326,000 gallons. It is enough to supply the annual indoor and outdoor needs of 2 to 3 average American households, depending on climate and conservation. When engineers speak about millions of acre-feet, they are describing volumes so enormous that they become almost impossible to imagine. Yet even numbers this large can create a dangerous illusion. Seeing tens of millions of acre-feet still stored inside the reservoirs makes it easy to believe there is plenty of time left. The reality is more complicated because reservoirs do not become useless only when they are empty. They begin losing critical functions long before that point. Think of a massive savings account. Imagine someone begins with $100,000. Spending $63,000 still leaves $37,000 in the account. Most people would not call that bankrupt. But if that remaining money must pay every future emergency, every unexpected expense, and every essential bill without knowing when the next paycheck will arrive, the meaning of that balance changes completely. The number itself has not changed. Its ability to absorb another shock has. That is exactly what has happened across the Colorado River Basin. The remaining water is no longer simply a supply. It has become the reserve standing between normal operations and increasingly difficult choices. The next headline number is even more unsettling. Forecasts for unregulated inflow into Lake Powell during the current water year have fallen to roughly 30% of the long-term historical average. That means, for every 10 buckets of water the reservoir would normally expect from snowmelt and runoff, only about 3 are projected to arrive. The missing 7 buckets cannot simply be replaced by optimism or careful reservoir management, because no engineer can release water that never entered the system. Every forecast revision therefore changes the mathematics of the entire basin. Less inflow means less flexibility. Less flexibility means every operational decision carries greater consequences. Another number, often misunderstood, is the elevation of Lake Powell itself. People naturally focus on how much water remains inside the reservoir, but dam operators pay close attention to the height of the water surface above sea level because elevation determines pressure. The target everyone watches is not the absolute bottom of the lake. It is approximately 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool elevation. Above that level, Glen Canyon Dam can continue generating electricity. Below that level, water may still exist in the reservoir, but the turbines can no longer operate as designed. This distinction is crucial because the reservoir does not have to disappear before one of its most valuable functions disappears. Another comparison makes the scale easier to understand. Lake Powell stretches for nearly 200 miles when full, with hundreds of side canyons branching away from the main channel. Looking across that vast surface, it is almost impossible to believe a difference of only several dozen vertical feet could transform the way the entire system operates. Yet those few feet represent billions of gallons of stored water and the hydraulic pressure that drives one of the largest hydropower facilities in the American West. A person standing on the shoreline cannot easily recognize the difference between a reservoir operating comfortably and one approaching a critical threshold. Engineers can. Every foot of declining elevation removes another layer of operational flexibility. Every forecast showing weaker snowmelt shortens the distance between normal conditions and emergency planning. The numbers become even more striking when compared with everyday experience. Most people think about weather one season at a time. Reservoir managers think in decades. A single wet winter can temporarily raise water levels, but one good year cannot erase more than 2 decades of cumulative storage losses, rising temperatures, increasing evaporation, and repeated years of below-average runoff. The Colorado River system was designed around the expectation that wet periods would eventually refill what dry periods removed. What makes the current situation unusual is not simply that drought exists. Drought has always existed in the American Southwest. What makes this different is that the reserve built to survive drought has become much thinner, while temperatures continue increasing the amount of water lost before it ever reaches the reservoirs. That is why the headline number is not 37%, 30%, or even 3,490 feet. The real headline is that every one of those numbers points toward the same conclusion. The Colorado River is no longer operating with the generous safety margin that defined most of the 20th century. It is operating with a shrinking buffer, where each disappointing snow season matters more than the last. Each foot of declining elevation carries greater weight than before, and each decision must be made with fewer reserves available to correct a mistake. That is the difference between a system that merely survives drought and one that is slowly running out of the capacity to absorb it. Most people believe the greatest danger begins when a reservoir runs out of water. That assumption sounds logical, but it hides the most important mechanism in the entire Colorado River system. The real turning point arrives much earlier. The system does not have to lose all of its water before it begins losing its most valuable functions. That is the detail almost everyone misses. It is not the amount of water alone that determines whether Glen Canyon Dam can continue doing its job. It is the height of that water. That difference changes everything. Imagine 2 identical buckets filled with the same amount of water. One sits on the roof of a skyscraper, the other rests on the ground. Both contain exactly the same volume, but only one has enough elevation to release significant energy. Water stores energy not simply because it exists, but because gravity has somewhere to pull it. Hydropower depends on that invisible reserve. Every foot of elevation inside Lake Powell is like another layer of compressed potential waiting to be converted into electricity. As long as enough height remains, the turbines continue spinning efficiently. As the lake falls, that invisible reserve begins disappearing long before the reservoir itself appears empty. This is where the story changes from a drought narrative into an engineering narrative. The public usually watches photographs of shrinking shorelines, exposed rock formations, abandoned boat ramps, and widening bathtub rings along the canyon walls. Those images are dramatic, But they are not the first warning signs that concern dam operators. Engineers are watching a different number entirely. They watch reservoir elevation, because elevation determines hydraulic head, the pressure created by the weight of water above the turbines. That pressure is what transforms flowing water into mechanical rotation and electrical power. Lose enough hydraulic head, and the turbines gradually lose performance. Lose more, and they can no longer operate within their design limits. The reservoir may still contain millions of acre-feet of water. Yet, one of its most important functions has already begun to disappear. This is the critical distinction, almost never explained in ordinary news coverage. It is not the shoreline that decides whether electricity is generated. It is not the total storage volume. It is not even whether water continues flowing downstream. The decisive factor is whether enough elevation remains above the powerhouse to create sufficient pressure. That single engineering constraint is far more important than the visual appearance of the lake. In other words, the first crisis may not be about drinking water at all. It may be about energy. That sounds counterintuitive, because people naturally associate rivers with water supply first and electricity second. Yet in the Colorado River system, those two functions are deeply connected while remaining fundamentally different. Water deliveries can often continue under conditions where hydropower production becomes increasingly difficult. Water can still be released through the dam even if the turbines are producing less electricity or eventually stop operating. The river keeps flowing, but one of the system's economic and operational engines begins slowing down. That subtle difference creates consequences far beyond the dam itself. Hydropower from Glen Canyon Dam is not simply another source of electricity competing in a marketplace. It provides relatively inexpensive renewable energy that can respond rapidly when demand changes throughout the day. Utilities rely on that flexibility because electricity cannot simply be stored in unlimited quantities. Every second, supply must closely match demand. Hydropower excels at making quick adjustments when air conditioners suddenly switch on during a heat wave or when solar generation falls as evening approaches. If that flexible resource weakens, replacement electricity must come from somewhere else. Sometimes that replacement is available. Sometimes it is more expensive. Sometimes it travels farther across already stressed transmission lines. Sometimes it produces higher emissions. The point is not that the lights immediately go out. The point is that the entire system becomes less efficient, less resilient, and more expensive before most people even realize anything has changed. This is why the title of this story is not that the Colorado River is running out of water. It is that the Colorado River is running out of buffer. Buffer is an invisible concept, which is why it receives so little attention. It cannot be photographed from a helicopter. Tourists cannot point to it from a scenic overlook. Yet buffer is what separates routine operations from emergency management. Every reservoir stores two different things at the same time. It stores water and it stores options. Water satisfies today's needs. Options protect tomorrow's uncertainty. As Lake Powell falls, those options disappear first. Managers have fewer choices about when to release water, how much electricity can be generated, how downstream obligations can be balanced, and how unexpected drought can be absorbed. That shrinking flexibility is the real story unfolding beneath the surface. Another misunderstanding comes from the phrase dead pool, which often appears in dramatic headlines. Dead pool refers to a condition where water can no longer flow through the dam by gravity because the reservoir surface has fallen below the outlet structures. It represents one of the final engineering limits of the reservoir. Minimum power pool is very different. It arrives much earlier. At that point, the reservoir may still contain an enormous volume of water, but there is insufficient hydraulic head to operate the turbines as designed. Confusing these two thresholds leads many people to believe everything remains safe until the lake is nearly empty. In reality, one critical function can be lost while another continues operating. That distinction transforms the entire timeline of risk. Instead of asking when the Colorado River might fail completely, the more important question becomes, which function fails first? The answer is not drinking water. It is not irrigation deliveries. It is not navigation. The earliest warning may come from the powerhouse itself, where declining elevation quietly removes the pressure that has driven giant turbines for generations. The river will still flow, the reservoir will still exist, the canyon will still appear filled with water from many viewpoints. Yet beneath that calm surface, one of the most sophisticated pieces of infrastructure in the American West may already be telling engineers that the safety margin designed into the system decades ago is steadily disappearing. That is the hidden story. Not the shrinking shoreline, but the shrinking pressure. Not the visible water, but the invisible elevation. Not the reservoir running dry, but the buffer running out first. To understand why the Colorado River system can begin failing long before it runs out of water, it is necessary to follow a chain of events that starts thousands of feet above the reservoir, long before a single drop reaches Lake Powell. Every winter, storms crossing the Pacific Ocean leave snow across the Rocky Mountains. At first, that snow appears frozen and motionless, but engineers see it differently. They see it as future storage. Snow is not simply frozen water. It is a delayed delivery system. Instead of sending every drop into the river immediately, the mountains hold that water for months, releasing it gradually as temperatures rise. That slow release is one of nature's greatest engineering achievements, because it spreads runoff across spring and early summer, rather than concentrating everything into a few violent storms. For generations, the Colorado River depended on that rhythm. Snow accumulated. Temperatures warmed slowly. Meltwater entered streams. Tributaries merged into larger rivers. The Colorado River carried that runoff into Lake Powell, where another layer of storage began. The reservoir became a second savings account, storing water that could be released when farms, cities, and power systems needed it most. That was the original design, but the mechanism has begun changing in ways that are not immediately obvious. The first reason is temperature. A warmer atmosphere behaves like a larger sponge. Before snowmelt even reaches a river, increasingly dry soils absorb more moisture because years of heat have left the landscape thirsty. Scientists sometimes describe this as soil moisture deficit, but the idea is remarkably simple. Imagine pouring the same bucket of water onto two different sponges. One sponge is already wet. The other has been left in the sun for days. The dry sponge captures far more water before anything begins dripping through. Western landscapes now behave more like that dry sponge after repeated hot years. The result is that identical snowfall can produce very different amounts of runoff. The mountains may receive a respectable winter snowpack, yet streams still carry less water because more of the melting snow disappears into dry ground, evaporates into warmer air, or is taken up by vegetation before reaching the river. This process has become one of the most important hidden mechanisms behind declining inflow into Lake Powell. It is not always that less snow falls. Sometimes less snow survives the journey. Once the reduced runoff finally reaches the reservoir, another mechanism takes over. Lake Powell stores water because the Glen Canyon Dam blocks the natural river, creating a deep lake whose surface stands hundreds of feet above the turbines. That vertical distance is called hydraulic head, and it is the heart of hydropower generation. Gravity performs the work. Water enters massive intake structures, high inside the reservoir, accelerates through giant steel penstocks, strikes turbine blades with enormous force, spins generators weighing hundreds of tons, and electricity begins flowing into transmission lines, serving communities across the American West. Every stage of this process depends on one thing remaining true. The water surface must stay high enough above the turbines to provide sufficient pressure. Many people imagine the turbines simply sitting inside flowing water, like underwater windmills, but that image is misleading. They function more like a giant pressure engine. The greater the height of the water above them, the greater the force available to rotate the machinery. Lower the water surface, and every gallon carries slightly less energy. Lower it again, and efficiency declines further. Continue lowering it, and the operating window narrows until the turbines can no longer function safely or effectively. That is why engineers spend so much time monitoring elevation rather than volume alone. A reservoir may still contain an extraordinary amount of water, while simultaneously losing the pressure needed to convert that water into reliable electricity. This is the mechanism hidden beneath every discussion of minimum power pool. It is not an arbitrary number chosen for administrative convenience. It is the point where the laws of physics begin replacing the intentions of policymakers. No legislation can increase hydraulic pressure once the reservoir surface has fallen below the necessary elevation. Gravity cannot negotiate, yet the mechanism extends beyond the powerhouse itself. Reduced hydropower does not remain confined inside Glen Canyon Dam. It spreads through an interconnected network. Imagine a summer afternoon when air conditioners across the southwest suddenly switch on as temperatures climb well above 100 degrees. Electricity demand rises rapidly. Under normal conditions, hydropower can respond within minutes, increasing output to stabilize the grid while other power plants adjust. That flexibility is one of its greatest strengths. If reservoir elevation has reduced available generation, grid operators must immediately search elsewhere for replacement electricity. Natural gas plants may increase production. Electricity may be imported from neighboring regions. Batteries may discharge. Transmission lines may carry heavier loads. Every alternative has costs, physical limits, or timing constraints. None of these adjustments necessarily create a blackout, but each removes another layer of flexibility from a system already coping with extreme heat, growing populations, and increasing electricity demand. The mechanism then reaches ordinary lives in surprisingly direct ways. A rancher irrigating alfalfa depends on pumps powered by electricity. A hospital depends on reliable transmission during heat emergencies. A water treatment plant requires continuous power to move and purify drinking water. A refrigerated warehouse storing food relies on uninterrupted cooling. A tribal community waiting for expanded water infrastructure depends on affordable electricity to operate pumping stations. A rural electric cooperative purchasing federal hydropower may suddenly face higher wholesale prices if replacement electricity becomes necessary. None of these people wake up thinking about hydraulic head. Yet hydraulic head quietly influences the cost, reliability, and resilience of systems they use every day. This is why the Colorado River story cannot be reduced to a discussion about rainfall or drought alone. The central mechanism passes through every layer of the system. Warmer air changes snowmelt efficiency. Reduced runoff lowers reservoir elevation. Lower elevation reduces hydraulic head. Reduced hydraulic head weakens hydropower generation. Weaker hydropower increases dependence on alternative electricity. Higher energy costs and reduced operational flexibility ripple outward through water delivery systems, agriculture, public services, and household budgets. One physical change at the top of the watershed gradually becomes an economic and social change hundreds of miles away. That chain reaction explains why engineers worry about buffer instead of absolute scarcity. Buffer is what interrupts the chain before it reaches people. Deep reservoirs absorb poor runoff years. Strong hydraulic head protects electricity generation. Flexible power supplies stabilize the grid. Financial reserves soften price increases. When every layer still has room to absorb stress, society notices very little. But as each layer becomes thinner, the same dry year produces larger consequences. The mechanism does not become more dramatic. It simply becomes less forgiving. That is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. The Colorado River system is not approaching a single catastrophic moment where everything suddenly stops. It is moving through a sequence of physical thresholds, each quietly removing one capability after another. First, the snow becomes less efficient. Then the reservoir loses elevation. Then the turbines lose pressure. Then the electrical system loses flexibility. Then communities lose choices. By the time most people recognize the crisis, the mechanism has already been operating for years, hidden in plain sight, following the unchanging laws of gravity, heat, and water. History has a way of exposing the assumptions hidden inside great engineering projects, and nowhere is that clearer than along the Colorado River. For much of the 20th century, Lake Powell represented confidence. It was designed to store enormous volumes of water, regulate flows between the upper and lower basin, protect downstream water deliveries during drought, reduce flood risks, and generate reliable hydropower for millions of people. The reservoir was never intended to survive only average years. It was intentionally oversized because its designers understood that the American West has always experienced cycles of flood and drought. Their solution was straightforward: capture abundant water during wet decades and save it for dry ones. For many years, that strategy appeared remarkably successful. Reservoirs filled, hydropower flowed, cities expanded, agriculture spread across desert valleys. Entire generations grew up believing that the Colorado River system possessed almost unlimited resilience. The reservoirs became so reliable that most people forgot why they had been built with such enormous storage in the first place. That confidence began to change at the start of the 21st century. The year 2002 delivered one of the lowest inflows ever recorded into Lake Powell, with unregulated runoff reaching only about 28% of the long-term average. Until then, many people viewed severe drought as something that occurred occasionally before normal conditions returned. Instead, that year became the opening chapter of what scientists now describe as the early 21st century megadrought, one of the driest multi-decade periods in the region for many centuries, according to tree ring reconstructions and modern observations. At first, the decline appeared temporary. Reservoir managers expected future wet years to restore much of the lost storage. Sometimes they did recover part of it. Snowy winters occasionally lifted water levels and produced encouraging headlines. Boat ramps reopened, shorelines moved upward, public attention faded. Yet every recovery proved incomplete. The reservoirs never fully regained the protective cushion that had existed decades earlier. One dry period was no longer being erased by the next wet period. Instead, each recovery started from a lower baseline than before. That gradual downward staircase is one of the most important lessons history offers. The danger was never a single catastrophic drought. The danger was a sequence of moderately bad years, arriving before the previous losses had been repaired. Scientists studying the Colorado River Basin reached another critical conclusion. Rising temperatures were changing the behavior of the watershed itself. Even when snowfall remained near historical averages in some years, warmer conditions increased evaporation, dried soils more rapidly, lengthened growing seasons, and reduced the fraction of melting snow that ultimately reached rivers and reservoirs. This finding helped explain a puzzle that had confused observers for years. Why were respectable snowpacks sometimes producing disappointing runoff? The answer was that the watershed itself had changed. More water was being consumed before it could become stream flow. In other words, the mountains were still collecting water, but they were delivering a smaller percentage of it downstream. History also provides another revealing comparison. During earlier decades, reservoir operators usually managed drought by releasing water that had accumulated during previous wet years. Those stored reserves acted as a financial savings account built over generations, but every withdrawal reduced that account, and repeated withdrawals eventually became larger than new deposits. The reservoirs were no longer balancing 1 or 2 difficult years. They were supporting an extended period in which inflows frequently remained below expectations, while demand across the Southwest continued to grow. The engineering philosophy that had worked for generations was suddenly facing a climate that behaved differently from the one used during the original planning process. By the early 2020s, conditions had become serious enough that federal managers implemented emergency measures rarely imagined when the system was constructed. Water was retained in Lake Powell by reducing downstream releases, and additional water was released from upstream reservoirs, such as Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo Reservoir, to help protect critical elevations at Glen Canyon Dam. These actions were extraordinary, not because they solved the problem, but because they demonstrated that the existing operating rules alone were no longer providing sufficient protection. Engineers were no longer simply managing water, they were defending the ability of the infrastructure itself to continue functioning. That distinction matters because it marks a shift from routine operations to system preservation. Another historical lesson comes from looking beyond individual drought years. Tree ring records, stretching back many centuries, reveal that the Colorado River Basin has experienced prolonged megadroughts long before modern reservoirs existed. Those ancient droughts lasted decades rather than seasons. They remind us that the climate of the American Southwest has always been capable of producing extreme dry periods. However, the present situation differs in one crucial respect. Earlier societies did not depend on giant hydroelectric dams, sprawling metropolitan regions, interstate water agreements, and millions of acres of highly productive irrigated agriculture. Modern civilization has multiplied both the benefits provided by the river and the consequences of its decline. A drought that once affected scattered settlements now influences regional power grids, national food supplies, industrial production, transportation networks, and the daily lives of tens of millions of people. That is why comparisons with the past must be made carefully. History proves that severe drought is natural. It also shows that today's infrastructure has far more to lose because far more depends upon the river than ever before. Perhaps the most revealing comparison is not between two different droughts, but between two different kinds of safety margin. Decades ago, reservoirs entered dry years with abundant stored water. Today, many dry years begin after previous droughts have already reduced storage significantly. The climate event may look similar on paper, but the system receiving that event is fundamentally different. Imagine two identical bridges carrying the same heavy truck. One bridge is brand new, the other has slowly lost bolts, developed small cracks, and endured decades of repeated stress. The weight of the truck has not changed, yet the level of risk is completely different because the condition of the bridge has changed. That is exactly where the Colorado River system stands today. The drought is only part of the story. Equally important is the condition of the infrastructure absorbing that drought. Every year of below-average runoff now lands on reservoirs with thinner reserves, on management systems with fewer easy options, and on communities increasingly aware that the next difficult year will not arrive in the same system that existed 20 or 30 years ago. History, therefore, does not simply explain how the Colorado River reached this point. It explains why the current warnings deserve attention. They are not predictions built on imagination. They are the continuation of patterns that have been unfolding for more than 2 decades, supported by observations, confirmed by research, and reinforced each time the reservoirs recover less than they lose. The lesson history leaves behind is both simple and unsettling. Systems rarely fail because of one extraordinary event. More often, they fail because each new challenge arrives before the damage from the previous one has been fully repaired. That is the story Lake Powell has been quietly telling for more than 20 years, and it is the reason engineers now pay as much attention to what has already been lost as they do to what still remains. When people imagine the Colorado River under stress, they often picture a giant reservoir steadily shrinking until everyone suffers equally. Reality is far more complicated and far more unsettling. Infrastructure almost never fails all at once. It fails at its weakest connections. The Colorado River system is no different. The greatest vulnerability is not the enormous concrete wall of Glen Canyon Dam, nor the vast expanse of Lake Powell stretching across the canyon. The greatest vulnerability lies inside dozens of smaller components that depend upon one another with almost no room for error. A single reduction in reservoir elevation can quietly affect a turbine. A weaker turbine can reduce available hydropower. Less hydropower can force utilities to purchase replacement electricity. More expensive electricity can increase operating costs for irrigation pumps, water treatment plants, and rural cooperatives. The first fracture may be only a few inches wide, yet the crack continues spreading through systems that most people never realize are connected. Consider a farmer in central Arizona, preparing for another growing season. Water does not simply appear in irrigation canals because a reservoir exists hundreds of miles away. Pumps must move it, gates must regulate it, control systems must monitor it. Electricity powers almost every step, If low-cost federal hydropower becomes less available, irrigation districts may face higher energy expenses. Higher operating costs do not automatically eliminate farming, but they narrow financial margins that have already been squeezed by rising fuel prices, fertilizer costs, labor shortages, and increasingly unpredictable weather. For a large agricultural corporation, those increases may become another business expense. For a smaller family operation already balancing debt, equipment payments, and uncertain harvests, the same increase may influence decisions about which fields can be planted, which crops remain profitable, or whether another season is financially possible. The vulnerability is not the river alone, it is the economic chain attached to the river. Follow the system another step, and another weak point appears. Rural electric cooperatives across the western United States have historically benefited from relatively affordable hydropower generated at federal dams. These cooperatives often serve sparsely populated communities, where building new generation or transmission infrastructure is more expensive on a per-customer basis than in large metropolitan areas. When inexpensive hydropower declines, replacement electricity frequently costs more. The additional expense eventually works its way into budgets, infrastructure investments, maintenance schedules, or customer bills. Residents in those communities may never hear the phrase hydraulic head, yet the consequences quietly arrive through monthly expenses rather than dramatic headlines. Another weak link sits beneath the ground rather than above it. Across much of the Southwest, groundwater has become an increasingly important backup during drought. When surface water deliveries become uncertain, wells often pump more heavily to compensate. Yet groundwater pumping also depends on electricity. As energy costs rise, extracting deeper groundwater becomes more expensive. In some regions, wells must reach hundreds or even thousands of feet below the surface. Powerful electric motors lift enormous volumes of water every day. If both water scarcity and energy costs increase simultaneously, one backup system begins placing greater stress on another. The result is not simply less water or more expensive electricity. It is a feedback loop in which each pressure reinforces the next. Then there are the communities that have historically carried a disproportionate share of water insecurity, despite living within the Colorado River Basin itself. Many tribal nations possess legally recognized water rights dating back generations, yet significant portions of those communities still lack the infrastructure necessary to fully access, transport, treat, or distribute the water allocated to them. In some areas, families continue relying on hauled water because pipelines, treatment facilities, or pumping systems have never been completed. For these communities, the conversation is not merely about declining reservoir levels, it is about whether already delayed infrastructure becomes even more difficult to finance and operate. If energy costs rise and water management grows increasingly complex. The vulnerability here is not legal entitlement, it is physical infrastructure. Rights on paper cannot deliver water without pumps, pipes, storage tanks, and reliable electricity. Cities appear stronger, yet they possess vulnerabilities of their own. Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Los Angeles, San Diego, and countless smaller municipalities have invested billions of dollars in conservation, wastewater recycling, groundwater banking, and diversified water portfolios. These investments have significantly improved resilience, but resilience does not mean immunity. Urban water systems still depend on treatment plants, pumping stations, pressure zones, emergency generators, communication networks, and skilled operators working around the clock. Every additional layer of operational complexity increases the importance of reliable electricity and predictable water management. A temporary disruption in one sector can quickly create additional strain in another. Hospitals require uninterrupted power, not only for patient care, but also for sterilization systems, cooling equipment, electronic records, and life support technology. Water utilities require continuous electricity to disinfect drinking water and maintain pressure throughout distribution networks. Telecommunications rely on cooling systems and backup generators. Food distribution centers require refrigeration. None of these facilities sits directly on the shore of Lake Powell, yet each is connected through the invisible web of infrastructure supported by reliable energy and water. Perhaps the most overlooked vulnerability of all is psychological rather than physical. Modern societies become extremely efficient when they trust that critical infrastructure will continue operating tomorrow exactly as it did yesterday. Businesses sign long-term contracts. Farmers choose perennial crops, requiring years of investment. Cities approve housing developments designed to last generations. Utilities build financial models assuming predictable operating costs. Every one of these decisions depends upon confidence in the stability of foundational systems. As uncertainty grows, planning itself becomes more expensive. Engineers design for larger safety margins. Governments prepare additional contingency plans. Utilities maintain greater reserve capacity. Investors demand higher returns to compensate for uncertainty. None of these responses appears dramatic in isolation. Yet together, they represent an invisible economic cost, paid long before any physical shortage becomes obvious. This is why the Colorado River story is fundamentally about systems rather than individual events. A declining reservoir does not simply threaten one dam. It places pressure on every connected layer that has quietly relied on that dam for decades. Like a line of gears inside a watch, each component may appear small when viewed alone. Remove one gear, however, and the entire mechanism loses its ability to keep accurate time. The Colorado River Basin contains thousands of such gears: turbines, transformers, pumping stations, canals, pipelines, reservoir operating rules, interstate agreements, tribal settlements, agricultural schedules, transmission lines, water treatment plants, emergency response plans, financial contracts. None of them seems especially fragile when examined independently. Together, they create one of the most sophisticated infrastructure systems ever constructed in North America. That sophistication is also its vulnerability, because highly interconnected systems depend upon every critical component remaining within its operating limits. The shrinking buffer inside Lake Powell therefore represents far more than declining water storage. It signals that the entire network is beginning to operate closer to its design boundaries. The danger is not that every component fails together. The danger is that each successive dry year quietly pushes another small component beyond its comfort zone, forcing the remaining parts to carry more of the load. At first, the adjustments seem manageable. Then they become routine. Eventually, they become permanent. By that point, the question is no longer whether the river still contains water. The question becomes, how many invisible safety margins have already disappeared before society finally notices that the system supporting millions of lives is no longer operating with the resilience it once took for granted. At first glance, the story of Lake Powell appears to belong only to the American Southwest. A shrinking reservoir, a long drought, a difficult water management problem. But that interpretation misses the larger pattern unfolding beneath the surface. The Colorado River is becoming one of the clearest examples of how climate change, infrastructure, economics, and population growth are beginning to interact as a single system instead of separate challenges. The reservoir is not simply losing water. It is revealing what happens when multiple layers of resilience begin shrinking at the same time. Throughout the 20th century, engineers designed critical infrastructure around the assumption that history provided a reliable guide to the future. Reservoir capacities were calculated from river records. Flood protection relied on historical extremes. Water rights reflected expected long-term supplies. Electrical systems assumed hydropower would continue providing dependable flexibility. Cities expanded because planners believed the combination of reservoirs, pipelines, and engineering could smooth out natural variability. Those assumptions were never irrational. They reflected the best knowledge available at the time. What is changing today is not the intelligence of those designs, but the environment in which those designs must operate. The baseline itself is shifting. A warmer atmosphere changes the efficiency of snowmelt. Longer heat waves increase evaporation from soils, vegetation, and reservoirs. Population continues growing in many of the fastest expanding regions of the Southwest. Electricity demand rises as hotter summers increase air conditioning use. At the same time, water conservation has become more successful in many cities. Yet conservation alone cannot create new runoff inside a river basin. These forces do not simply add together, they multiply each other's effects. That is why the Colorado River has become more than a regional water story. It has become a case study in systemic risk. One of the most important ideas emerging from modern infrastructure science is that resilience does not depend on eliminating every threat. It depends on maintaining enough buffer to absorb unexpected shocks without losing essential functions. Buffer exists everywhere, even when people rarely notice it. Snowpack is a seasonal buffer. Reservoir storage is a hydrological buffer. Hydropower is an electrical buffer because it can rapidly respond to changing demand. Groundwater is another buffer during dry years. Emergency operating agreements between states are political buffers. Financial reserves inside utilities are economic buffers. Backup generators are operational buffers. None of these systems is expected to work perfectly forever. Their purpose is to create time for managers to adapt, time for engineers to respond, time for communities to recover. The troubling pattern now appearing across the Colorado River Basin is that several of these buffers are becoming thinner simultaneously. Snow delivers less efficient runoff. Reservoir storage declines. Hydropower flexibility narrows. Groundwater faces increasing demand. Emergency operating rules become more complex. Public agencies spend more resources managing crisis instead of preparing for future resilience. Individually, each change appears manageable. Collectively, they reduce the ability of the entire system to absorb the next unexpected event. That is what systems engineers sometimes describe as the loss of adaptive capacity. The Colorado River therefore raises a question extending far beyond water. What happens when infrastructure built for one climate must function within another? This question is now appearing across the world. European rivers have experienced historically low water levels, affecting shipping and power generation. Hydroelectric systems in parts of South America have struggled during prolonged drought. Glaciers feeding rivers across Asia continue retreating. Mountain snowpacks in many regions melt earlier than they once did. Coastal infrastructure faces rising sea levels, while inland infrastructure faces increasing heat extremes. None of these events is identical, yet they share a common characteristic. They challenge systems designed around historical environmental conditions that are gradually becoming less representative of the future. This does not mean every reservoir will fail or every city will run out of water. It means the assumptions underlying many infrastructure systems require continual revision rather than occasional adjustment. That shift is historically significant. During much of the last century, engineers could reasonably assume that future climate variability would remain broadly similar to the past. Today, planning increasingly focuses on uncertainty itself. Instead of asking what average conditions look like, planners ask how much variability the system can survive. Instead of asking whether one dry year is unusual, they ask whether several difficult years can occur before recovery becomes possible. Instead of assuming historical records define safe operating conditions, they evaluate scenarios extending beyond previous experience. This represents a profound change in infrastructure philosophy. The objective is no longer simply optimizing efficiency. It is preserving resilience under uncertainty. The Colorado River illustrates another important concept that may define the coming decades. Modern civilization depends less on individual pieces of infrastructure than on networks of infrastructure. Water systems depend on electricity. Electricity depends on water for cooling and generation. Agriculture depends on both. Telecommunications depend on uninterrupted power. Hospitals depend on every one of them simultaneously. A disruption in one network increases pressure across several others. This interconnectedness creates enormous efficiency during stable conditions because each system supports the next. Yet it also creates new forms of vulnerability because stress rarely remains isolated. It propagates across the network like a wave, traveling through connected structures. Lake Powell demonstrates this principle with remarkable clarity. A warmer winter affects snow accumulation. Snow affects runoff. Runoff affects reservoir elevation. Reservoir elevation affects hydropower. Hydropower affects electricity markets. Electricity affects pumping costs. Pumping costs affect agriculture, municipal water systems, and household expenses. Every stage remains linked to the previous one through physical laws rather than political opinions. This is why the shrinking buffer matters more than the shrinking shoreline. Shorelines are visible. Buffer determines how disturbances travel through the system. Another concept quietly emerging from the Colorado River Basin is what many researchers call a new baseline. This phrase does not mean every future year will be worse than the last. Weather will continue producing wet years, snowy winters, and temporary recoveries. Reservoir levels may rise significantly under favorable conditions. The important question is different. After recovery occurs, where does the system stabilize? Does it return to the operating conditions common during the late 20th century, or does it settle into a different range, requiring different expectations, different operating rules, and different infrastructure investments? That distinction separates temporary crisis from structural change. If the baseline itself has shifted, then policies designed only to survive isolated drought years become increasingly inadequate. They must instead manage a future in which average conditions themselves may no longer resemble those that shaped earlier engineering decisions. This is already influencing negotiations over the post-2026 operating rules for the Colorado River. States, tribal nations, federal agencies, water districts, environmental organizations, agricultural interests, and energy providers are no longer debating how to respond to one difficult season. They are attempting to redesign management strategies for decades that may not resemble the past. Those negotiations are extraordinarily complex because every additional gallon of water assigned to one purpose necessarily reduces flexibility somewhere else. The shrinking buffer forces difficult conversations that abundant reserves once postponed. Yet perhaps the most important lesson reaches beyond engineering and public policy altogether. Human societies often recognize transformation only after old assumptions stop working. For decades, the Colorado River symbolized certainty. It represented a belief that enough infrastructure could overcome environmental variability. Today, it symbolizes something different. It demonstrates that even the largest engineering systems remain connected to physical limits that no amount of technology can completely eliminate. Technology can improve efficiency. It can reduce waste. It can expand flexibility. It can create remarkable resilience. But it cannot manufacture snow that never fell or hydraulic pressure that no longer exists. That realization is not a message of despair. It is a reminder that adaptation begins by recognizing which assumptions have changed. The Colorado River is not announcing the end of civilization in the American West. It is announcing the end of an era in which historical conditions could automatically be treated as the foundation for future planning. The shrinking buffer inside Lake Powell is therefore much more than a regional engineering concern. It is a signal that the relationship between climate, infrastructure, and society is entering a new phase, one in which resilience depends not on assuming yesterday will return, but on designing systems capable of functioning, even if it does not. The most important test of credibility in any climate and infrastructure story is not whether the evidence sounds alarming, it is whether the boundaries of that evidence remain clear. The Colorado River is under severe stress, but not every dramatic claim made about it is equally well supported. Some conclusions rest on decades of observations, physical measurements, and well-understood engineering. Others remain uncertain, conditional, or exaggerated. Distinguishing between them is not a weakness. It is the only way to understand the real danger without turning that danger into spectacle. The first fact, supported by strong evidence, is that the Colorado River Basin has become warmer. That warming matters because heat changes how water moves through the landscape. It increases evaporation from soil and vegetation, raises the atmosphere's demand for moisture, accelerates the drying of snow-free ground, and can reduce the amount of melting snow that ultimately reaches rivers. This does not mean every low runoff year is caused by climate change alone. Natural variability still determines where storms form, how much snow falls, and whether a particular winter becomes wet or dry. But warmer conditions can make a dry year more damaging and can reduce runoff even when snowfall appears less extreme than expected. The distinction is essential. Climate change does not need to create every drought to intensify the consequences of drought. The second conclusion, supported by basic physics, is that falling reservoir elevation reduces hydropower potential. The energy available from water depends partly on the vertical distance through which that water falls. As Lake Powell declines, hydraulic head declines with it. That relationship is not speculative. It is built into the design of Glen Canyon Dam. Lower elevation means less pressure, reduced generating capacity, and a narrower, safe operating range. If the reservoir falls below minimum power pool, the turbines cannot continue operating as intended. Yet even this fact must not be misrepresented. Minimum power pool is not the same as an empty reservoir. It is not the same as dead pool. It does not automatically mean water deliveries throughout the southwest stop on the same day. Water may still move through other outlet structures. Although operations become more difficult and less flexible, the danger is serious precisely because it is more subtle than the most dramatic version. A major function can disappear while the reservoir still contains a vast quantity of water. Another claim requiring careful treatment is the idea that Glen Canyon Dam is certain to stop generating electricity soon. That is not established. Federal projections are scenarios, not guarantees. They depend on future snowfall, spring temperatures, soil moisture, reservoir releases, upstream storage, management actions, and conservation decisions. A probable minimum forecast describes a severe outcome planners must prepare for. It does not declare that outcome inevitable. A sequence of strong snow seasons could improve reservoir elevation. Emergency operating changes could slow the decline. Reduced releases or transfers from upstream reservoirs could preserve critical levels temporarily. The accurate statement is that the risk has become credible enough to influence official planning. The inaccurate statement is that turbine shutdown is already unavoidable. The same caution applies to headlines declaring that the Colorado River is disappearing. The river is not vanishing in a literal sense. Water continues flowing through its tributaries, reservoirs, canals, and downstream reaches. The basin will continue receiving snow and rain. Wet years will continue occurring. The real issue is that long-term average flow may be lower than the level around which laws, infrastructure, and expectations were built. A river does not need to disappear to become insufficient for every demand placed upon it. Scarcity is not an absence of water. It is a mismatch between available supply, required deliveries, environmental needs, and the amount of reserve necessary to survive the next drought. That mismatch is the scientifically defensible concern. Another common mistake is treating one snowy winter as proof that the crisis has ended. A wet year can produce meaningful improvement. It can raise reservoir levels, increase soil moisture, reduce immediate pressure, and create more operating flexibility. Those benefits are real and should not be dismissed. But a temporary rise in storage does not automatically reverse decades of cumulative loss. Reservoir recovery depends not only on how much snow falls, but also on how much water enters the lake after soil absorption, evaporation, upstream use, and required releases are accounted for. A dramatic snowpack map may show deep mountain snow, while the final runoff remains less impressive. The evidence therefore supports neither extreme. One wet winter does not solve the structural problem, and one dry winter does not prove the system is beyond recovery. The correct interpretation requires observing trends across many years. There is also a tendency to connect every western heat wave, wildfire, dust storm, and low reservoir level into a single direct chain of causation. These events can be related through shared climatic conditions, but they are not interchangeable. Heat can increase evaporation and water demand. Drought can dry vegetation and raise wildfire risk. Wildfire can alter soils and affect water quality. Dust deposited on snow can accelerate melting. Yet the appearance of these events during the same season does not prove that one directly caused the others. Each relationship must be evaluated separately. Scientific credibility depends on resisting the temptation to transform correlation into certainty. The same principle applies to population growth. Rapid urban expansion in the southwest increases demand for housing, electricity, transportation, and water-related infrastructure. But population growth alone does not explain the decline of Lake Powell. Many cities have reduced per-person water use through conservation, reuse, landscaping changes, and efficiency programs. Agriculture remains the largest consumptive user of Colorado River water, but even that fact can be oversimplified. Farmers grow food, livestock feed, and products embedded in regional and national economies. Reducing agricultural use may conserve large volumes, but it can also affect rural employment, food prices, land values, and local communities. The honest analysis is not that cities are solely responsible or that agriculture is solely responsible. The problem comes from a river system asked to satisfy legal, economic, ecological, and social commitments that collectively exceed what increasingly dry conditions can reliably provide. Another exaggerated claim is that hydropower loss at Glen Canyon Dam would cause the western electrical grid to collapse. The grid is too large and diverse for that conclusion. Electricity could be replaced through natural gas generation, solar power, wind power, batteries, imports, demand management, or other resources. Grid operators plan for outages and changing supply. Yet dismissing the loss as insignificant would be equally misleading. Glen Canyon hydropower is valuable because it is dispatchable, meaning output can be adjusted relatively quickly. Its reduction could increase costs, complicate balancing during peak demand, require greater use of fossil generation, and place more pressure on transmission and replacement capacity. The realistic danger is not instant continental blackout. It is a less flexible and potentially more expensive grid, operating during periods when heat already drives who demand upward. That is a more defensible conclusion, and in many ways, a more useful one. The public can prepare for rising costs and declining flexibility. It cannot prepare intelligently for a fictional apocalypse. The phrase, new baseline, must also be handled carefully. Scientists cannot identify a single permanent reservoir level or annual flow that will define every future decade. Natural variability will continue producing large swings. Climate models contain ranges rather than one exact prediction. Policy choices can alter demand. Conservation can reduce pressure. Technology can improve efficiency. A new baseline, therefore, does not mean the future has become perfectly predictable. It means the historical range used for planning may no longer be sufficient. Managers must prepare for conditions that are hotter, more variable, and less forgiving than those experienced during much of the 20th century. The risk is not that every year becomes catastrophically dry. The risk is that the same dry year now arrives in a warmer basin and strikes reservoirs with less stored water. There are also important questions that remain unsettled. Future precipitation across the Colorado River headwaters is less certain than future temperature. Researchers are more confident that warming will continue than they are about exactly how annual snowfall totals will change. Storm tracks may shift. Individual decades may become wetter or drier. Changes in vegetation, wildfire, dust, and land management could further influence runoff. These uncertainties should not be used as excuses for inaction, because uncertainty works in both directions. Conditions may improve more than expected, but they may also deteriorate faster. Infrastructure planning has never required perfect certainty. Engineers reinforce a bridge not because they know the exact truck that will damage it, but because they recognize the consequences of insufficient safety margin. The real risk facing the Colorado River is therefore not a single dramatic prediction. It is the convergence of several well-supported facts. The basin is warmer. The reservoirs have lost much of their stored buffer. Low elevation reduces hydropower capacity. Demand remains substantial. Operating rules are being reconsidered because the old framework is under stress. None of these facts proves that the system will collapse. Together, they prove that the margin for avoiding failure has narrowed. That is the line separating evidence from exaggeration. The Colorado River is not gone. Glen Canyon Dam has not stopped generating power. Cities are not about to become uninhabitable overnight, but the system is operating closer to thresholds that once seemed remote, and every foot of lost elevation makes future drought harder to absorb. The scientifically honest warning is not that disaster is certain. It is that the system now has fewer ways to prevent a severe year from becoming a severe consequence. The white line along the canyon walls remains the clearest image of what the Colorado River system has already lost. It marks the height where water once stood, but it also marks something less visible, the depth of confidence that once surrounded the system. Above that line is exposed stone. Below it is the remaining reservoir. Between them lies the missing buffer, the water that once absorbed dry years, delayed difficult decisions, protected power generation, and allowed millions of people to believe that the next drought would be managed much like the last one. Today, that assumption is becoming harder to defend. Lake Powell still holds water. Glen Canyon Dam still generates electricity. The river still moves through turbines, canyons, canals, farms, cities, and tribal lands. Nothing about the scene resembles total collapse. That is precisely why the warning is easy to ignore. Systems rarely announce their most important changes with a single dramatic moment. More often, they lose capacity gradually, one function at a time, while the surface appears familiar. The Colorado River does not need to disappear before the consequences become serious. It only needs to fall far enough for gravity to stop doing one of the jobs society assigned to it. That is the central truth of this story. The first major loss may not be water itself. It may be the ability to convert stored water into fast, flexible electricity. A reservoir can remain visually immense while becoming operationally weaker. A river can continue flowing while the infrastructure built around that flow loses resilience. The difference between water remaining and the system remaining functional is the difference between inventory and capacity. That distinction will shape the future of the American West. For decades, the Colorado River was treated as both a resource and a machine. The resource was water. The machine was the network of dams, turbines, canals, transmission lines, pumping stations, legal agreements, and financial arrangements that transformed that water into electricity, food, urban growth, and economic stability. The machine worked so reliably that its complexity disappeared from public view. A switch was flipped, and electricity arrived. A gate opened, and irrigation water entered a field. A pump activated, and drinking water climbed toward a desert city. Each result appeared independent. In reality, they were connected by one physical system whose stability depended on elevation, timing, temperature, and stored reserve. Now that reserve is shrinking, and the connections are becoming visible again. The loss of hydropower would not mean that every light across the West suddenly goes dark. The electrical grid has other power plants, solar farms, wind facilities, batteries, transmission links, and emergency resources. Replacement power can be found, but replacement is not the same as equivalence. Glen Canyon Hydropower is valuable not only because of how much electricity it produces, but because of when it can produce it, how quickly output can change, and how it supports utilities that depend on relatively affordable federal power. Losing part of that capability would not create one spectacular blackout. It would create a more difficult system. Electricity could cost more. Peak demand could become harder to balance. Rural cooperatives could face tighter budgets. Fossil generation could run more often. Transmission corridors could carry greater stress. Water systems that depend on electricity could become more expensive to operate. The damage would travel through prices, contracts, maintenance schedules, and reduced flexibility rather than through a single visible catastrophe. That kind of risk is harder to communicate, but it is often how modern systems actually weaken. The same is true for water. The Colorado River will not move from abundance to absence in one step. Shortages arrive through allocation changes, delayed projects, reduced planting, deeper pumping, stricter conservation, higher costs, and increasing competition over every remaining acre-foot. Some communities will adapt faster than others. Large cities with diversified supplies, advanced treatment systems, and greater financial capacity may buy time. Small towns, tribal communities without complete water infrastructure, rural utilities, and farmers operating on narrow margins may have far less room to maneuver. The headline number will describe the entire reservoir, but the consequences will never be distributed evenly. That is why the most important question is not simply how much water remains. It is who still has options when the buffer becomes thin. Every resilient system depends on the ability to choose among alternatives. A reservoir manager can change releases. A utility can purchase replacement power. A city can expand reuse. A farmer can shift crops. A state can renegotiate rules. But alternatives require time, money, infrastructure, political cooperation, and public trust. When the physical buffer shrinks, decision-makers must rely more heavily on those social and financial buffers. If those are weak as well, the system becomes brittle. One dry year then does more than lower a lake. It forces choices that had been postponed for decades. That is what Lake Powell is revealing now. It is not simply showing a shortage of water, it is showing a shortage of easy decisions. The future of the river will not be determined by one forecast, one winter, one court ruling, or one emergency release. It will be determined by whether the states, tribal nations, federal agencies, farmers, cities, utilities, and communities connected to the river can accept a basic physical reality. The system can no longer be managed as though every lost reserve will eventually return on the old schedule. Wet years will still come. Snow will still accumulate in the mountains. Reservoirs will still rise after favorable seasons. Those recoveries will matter. They can delay thresholds, restore flexibility, and create opportunities for reform. But a wet year must not be mistaken for the restoration of an old climate. The critical issue is not whether the reservoirs rise temporarily. It is whether the basin can rebuild enough buffer to survive the next sequence of hot and dry years without approaching the same emergency limits again. That requires more than hoping for snow. It requires rules designed for lower flows, power systems prepared for reduced hydropower, conservation that protects communities without placing every burden on those with the fewest resources, and infrastructure capable of operating under a wider range of conditions than the past demanded. None of those actions can guarantee that the river returns to its 20th century behavior. They can determine whether society remains functional as the river changes. That is the difference between adaptation and denial. Adaptation begins by preserving what still works, while redesigning what no longer fits. It recognizes that a reservoir is not merely a container, and that a dam is not merely a wall. They are parts of a larger system whose value depends on operating range. Once that range narrows, the goal cannot be simply keeping water behind concrete. The goal must be protecting the services that water provides, and preparing alternatives when those services can no longer be guaranteed. This does not make the future hopeless. The West has already demonstrated that water use can decline even as cities grow. Agricultural efficiency can improve, wastewater can be reused, leaky infrastructure can be repaired, power grids can become more diverse, turbines can be upgraded, agreements can be rewritten. Communities can prepare for conditions their predecessors never faced. The region is not powerless, but it is no longer protected by the same margin that allowed earlier generations to delay difficult choices. The window for adaptation is still open, yet the space inside that window is narrowing with the reservoir. That is why the image of the bathtub ring matters. It is not only evidence of what the river has lost, it is a record of time already spent. Every exposed layer of stone represents another season during which the system relied on stored water instead of structural change. The question now is whether the remaining water will be used only to postpone the next crisis or to create enough time for a different future. The event unfolding at Lake Powell will eventually change. Snowfall may improve, inflow may rise, reservoir elevation may stabilize or recover, headlines may move elsewhere, but the deeper message will remain. The Colorado River system has entered an era in which failure may begin before emptiness, in which power can disappear before water, and in which the smallest operational threshold can matter more than the largest visible reservoir. The river is not delivering a prophecy, it is delivering a measurement. It is showing how close a complex society has moved toward the limits of a system built for a different range of conditions. Water still stands behind Glen Canyon Dam, turbines still turn, transmission lines still carry electricity outward across the west. But as the distance between the reservoir surface and minimum power pool narrows, the warning becomes impossible to dismiss. The Colorado River does not need to stop flowing to change the future. It only needs to lose enough height for the world built around it to realize that the old margin is gone. The river will continue moving. The question is whether the system connected to it can change before the next function is lost.